Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next panel session. If I could just invite my co-panelists to switch on their video if they haven't already done so, that would be great. And we're going to get started. So this panel session is entitled A Good Deal for Nature, Incentives for Net Zero Economy. And I'm just going to briefly ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves rather than me fumble my words and do a poorer job of it. Dr. Rhian-Mari, Thomas, could we possibly start with you, please?
Of course, thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, everyone. Rhian-Mari Thomas, I'm the Chief Executive of the Green Finance Institute. We're a commercially focused, independent organisation tasked with mobilising more capital towards green and sustainable outcomes. We are supported and funded by Her Majesty's Government and the City of London Corporation.
Fantastic, thank you. And Peter Bingham, perhaps we could move to you next, please.
Hi, everybody. My name is Peter Bingham. I'm the Chief Engineer at Ofgem, the energy regulator in Great Britain.
Thank you. And next we've got Alexandra Bolton.
Good afternoon. I'm Alexandra Bolton. I'm the Executive Director at the Centre for Digital Build Britain, which is a partnership between BEIS and the University of Cambridge, looking at changing the way we design, build, operate and integrate our built environment.
Fantastic, and also an excellent tongue twister, it turns out. And finally, we've got Dimitri, possibly with supporting cast, I think.
Yes, I'm sorry, we're just taming the supporting cast.
Don't apologise.
Gagged and put in the cellar, as a joke. So I'm Dimitri Zenghelis, and I'm at the University of Cambridge and also at the London School of Economics. I'm working on sustainability, climate change, and also issues relating to broad measures of wealth.
Fantastic. So finally, I'm Alex van Someren. I'm a managing partner for early stage investing at venture capital firm Amadeus Capital Partners. And so I'm involved in investing in deep technology, including in the technology areas which have sustainability as one of their principal purposes. And I'm very pleased to have this esteemed panel to join us this afternoon and give us their wisdom on these challenges. I hope you've all been earlier attending the various sessions that have been taking place. There's been some really fantastic content earlier on in the day, and ideally we'll try and build on some of that. But I'm going to start out by just asking each of the panelists that are willing to respond to some questions that we've prepared in advance. And later on, we'll open up the proceedings to include questions from the audience. So I hope everybody is paying attention to the slide and can use Slido to enter their questions there. As far as I'm aware, unless they're about to surprise me, none of my panelists is planning to make a formal presentation involving any PowerPoint slides. That may be a relief to the audience, who I think have already had some of that. Instead, we're going to try and make it a reasonably dynamic, interactive conversation. So without further ado, the first question I wanted to address is, what policy levers are we seeing or could we see that could help us to achieve a good deal for nature and deliver the right kind of incentives for net zero? Who'd like to go first? Any panelists care to volunteer? Wave if it's you. Otherwise, I'm going to volunteer you myself. Dimitri, go.
Sure. So there's no magic wand or silver bullet or whatever you want to call it that can get this through. What is really important is that the policy set is sufficiently credible to galvanize expectations and garner investor confidence, so that businesses invest at scale in this, because the process of investing at scale is one of the things that's perhaps most effective at bringing the cost of some of these new technologies down and generating innovation. So you then generate this positive amplifying feedback whereby costs come down, so people deploy the new technologies and innovate, and because they innovate, the costs come down. And more people deploy them because they're obviously kind of more competitive and more appealing. So that would mean a bunch of internally consistent and coherent policies. You want to start with carbon pricing, obviously to change behavior, but that needs to be supported by things that for sectors that aren't very price sensitive, like efficiency. By definition, if inefficiency and waste is not price responsive. So there you need things like regulations and standards. You need to account for the fact that innovation has positive public spillovers and will tend to be underprovided. by the public sector. So you need support for early stage R&D, but also perhaps mission orientated support targeting particular sectors and support for deployment to pull through demand for new technologies. And then finally, you often need institutional reforms. In the UK, we've got a very successful Climate Change Act, which actually provides long-term credibility. But we've long needed an investment bank to support some of the private investors, leverage and scale up private finance in sectors with potential market failures. And don't forget, by the way, the sectors we're talking about, energy, transport, buildings, these are the most highly regulated and policy driven sectors. So they really need, policy risk is the major thing that spooks investors. So it's a mix of policy frameworks, institutional reform, and overarching credibility.
Very good. And Rhian-Mari, it looked like you're going to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to build on some of the points that Dimitri made. Fully agree with everything that he said. We have a fantastic case study here in the UK of how public-private collaboration through the setting up of the former Green Investment Bank managed to create a successful offshore wind industry in this country that is now entirely financed by institutional investment. And that provides such a fantastic blueprint to show how public finance was used in order to get over early stage construction and project risk and meet those investment gaps. There were also some specific contracts for differences and auctions and seabed leasing regulation that needed to be brought in, which again emphasizes the level of detail, and sadly that there's no sort of magic green bullet for any of these things. You do need to go to that level of granularity, but we've seen a fantastic example of how you can de-risk a new technology sector that eventually crowds in private capital. So we have high hopes for the new National Investment Bank that's been announced to act as that similar de-risking vehicle, if you like, risk mitigation vehicle for some of the technologies that we really need to see more investment in going forward. Green hydrogen, you touched on nature, Alex, some of those nature-based solutions, but also carbon capture storage, and the list goes on. So also wanted to emphasize my support for the carbon pricing argument that Dimitri came out with. And the final point that we're delighted to see that government has moved on is to issue a green sovereign bond. So bringing out a green gilt sets a great message in the run up to COP. We have seen in other jurisdictions where, and most notably in Ireland and Belgium actually, when they issued a green sovereign bond, there was a huge step up in domestic issuance. And sadly, even though the UK is a huge leader in green finance, we're really underweight in sterling green bond issuance from corporates. And so we're really hopeful that that's going to act as a real benchmark and really accelerate the mobilization of capital through the green bond market. I'll leave that there.
Great, very encouraging. Thanks for some specifics there. Peter, you look like you're unmuted and ready to go.
Yes, indeed. Hello there. So I just wanted to give you a little shout out, I guess, in terms of the work we've been doing over the last year on the real price control. So the real price control is for energy network companies. These are focused on gas and electricity transmission and gas distribution. And for those who don't know, RIO stands for revenue being linked to innovation and outputs in the main. The package of support, we announced on Tuesday that we are funding over the next 5 years £40 billion worth of investment in energy networks into a stronger, greener and fairer energy system for GB. As part of that package, there's £30 billion of upfront funding for the networks. That's both to run their networks as they are and to start greening their networks. And there's an additional £10 billion as part of that package for future network investment in green technology. As part of that package of work, there's £200 million of network innovation allowance funding, and a minimum of a further £450 million through what we call a strategic innovation fund. All of this is, all of this is intended to help those networks deliver this sort of net zero carbon energy future. Again, as part of the package, we are offering a return on equity for the network companies of 4.3% real. This is a really, really attractive package for investors to invest in these networks. That sort of return, and you get about 0.5% nominal at the bank at the moment. So, 4.3% real is quite attractive, we believe, to draw in international equity investment in these networks. And not forgetting vulnerable consumers, we're also putting sort of £132 million aside for networks to really sort of help vulnerable consumers. And particularly now with COVID situation, that's very, very relevant. That was all announced on Tuesday. We're moving forward with electricity distribution over the next 2 years. Again, for a similar sort of package of funding for them there will be really key enablers for the future electricity system, and we need to sort of invest in those networks to enable sort of decarbonisation of heat and transport, and generally those are quite data poor networks, and we want to encourage investment in digitising those networks as well.
That's great. Thanks so much. And Alexandra, anything you'd like to contribute?
Yes, although my background isn't in the financials of this, I think it's really important that we're joined up. We need to be joined up both in making sure that our data is shareable and is not siloed, but there are initiatives and our policy is also similarly not siloed. It's looking at the holistic picture so that you don't get pockets of excellence and pockets of desert, if you like, that we look across the whole system and we make sure that it works together as a system of systems rather than individuals. So from a policy lever, it's making sure that we have a joined up and coordinated approach to this, both on the financial aspects and in the data itself.
Very good. So in fact, during people's responses to that first question, we've covered in quite a number of areas the financial incentives that are being put in place. And I guess I'm just going to ask a cheeky question of my own. It seems to me that the justification for using financial incentives, especially deploying taxpayers' money to distort the market, if you like, really needs to be quite a high bar of justification. But on the other hand, I suppose we all feel this is a really urgent issue. Does the panel feel that the justification is here for deploying taxpayers' money in this way? And is that something which is unusual in the UK as a strategy, or is that a universally accepted perspective? Alexandra.
Thanks, Alex. So I'd like to point out that in 2017, the government published Data for the Public Good, and it is exactly what it says on the tin. It's about making sure that we use data for the public good. And from my perspective, I think that's absolutely what we should be spending public money on. What we don't want to see is back to these silos where there are pockets of commercial interest that don't produce the best outcome for the country, but for the planet as well. We need to work as a team, we need to work together. And the only way we can do that is if it is publicly funded.
Okay, but that's a nice indirect solution to actually get a secondary benefit, to ensure that the incentive is actually about making data available, and then that data can be used in a way which is productive for the primary agenda here, which is about achieving net zero. Thanks for that. Rhian-Mari, please.
Yeah, I was going to make a similar point, which is that using the public purse is not only there to fix market failures, but it can also be used to actively shape and create markets. And that required financing is then not only used for basic research, but can be used for more applied research and early stage financing of companies, which is when we're looking at the net zero transition and the need to invest in some of these new technologies, it absolutely is justified. And we've got some pretty good analogies, and I'm obviously quoting a bit of Mariana Mazzucato's points here, but the private sector quite often will find courage to invest after an entrepreneurial state has made the high risk investments in the first place. And I know she lists things like the internet, GPS, the iPhone touchscreen display and voice activated Siri. Apparently they were all financed by government. And the green revolution really needs that kind of patient public sector financing as well in order to get the green revolution off the ground.
Very good, thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to pick up a question that you might see in the chat. One of the audience has asked, what's the guidance around the carbon credits market as related to the new UK ETS? And I'm going to defer to the panel to explain what the new UK ETS is as they answer the question, if anybody would care to jump in. Or we can all decide that we don't know the answer to that question. And in that case, we're going to have to let the audience member tell us their own answer in the chat, and we're going to play it back to the audience later on. All right, we'll keep moving. So what about the reverse side? What about the barriers that you might see to us making progress with this agenda? Clearly, we've got a government who is currently actually showing all the right kind of signs in terms of the enthusiasm and incentives and policy. And I'm sure this is entirely unrelated to the fact that we're going to be in a very responsible position next year in terms of hosting various critical global conferences in this domain. But what are the other barriers or risks that the panel sees to potentially making progress with this issue? Anyone care to start?
I guess I'll just jump in and put the consumer's hand up, if you like, because ultimately it's consumers who foot the bill for energy and for greening the energy networks and for building new energy infrastructure. Yes, government does contribute, but ultimately it falls to consumers. And I spoke earlier on about vulnerable consumers. Many people are struggling to pay their bills. Many industries actually are struggling, and certainly the energy intensive industries are struggling to compete on the global stage. Therefore, the more you put on their bills, the more difficult it is going to be for consumers. It's more difficult for industry to compete. So that's one challenge.
Very good. And actually, just if I can just pick that up quickly, there's a nice practical example in the contrast in the experiences we've had with renewable energy incentives in the past few years, which have been very enthusiastically picked up by people, and solar panels have blossomed all over the nation's roofs. And on the other hand, the smart meter initiative, which seems to really be struggling despite incredible efforts of marketing by the energy companies to actually try and persuade consumers. And indeed, sadly, it appears some serious technical problems along the way just to reduce the enthusiasm that consumers have. So clearly getting consumers to actually feel like this stuff is really worth them engaging in is a complicated thing, and it's not as simple as providing financial incentives. One also needs to get the technology right. Dimitri, you look like you were ready to make a point.
I am. I mean, I would almost categorize the barriers in two ways. The first are barriers that are intertemporal. This follows on from what Rhian-Mari was saying. To some extent, that there are certain technologies and certain networks that are superior to the ones we have now. But we are so stuck in a historical way of doing things that inertia just wins through. We tend to sweat the assets we have, the ideas we have, people work in the areas that people have always worked in. It's what game theorists call strategic complementarities. The payoff to actually moving to a superior system is a function of how many other people move. You don't want to be the first onto a new network. You take on all the risks, the technologies are expensive, the finance is niche, and there aren't many market opportunities. But if everybody else moves, then you move. Of course, the problem here is the very act of moving, the very act of investing is what generates the cost reductions that make that prediction a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the role of policy here in guiding expectations is crucial, because otherwise you'll just carry on in an inferior network, even though you know that electric vehicles or renewable energy are actually going to be cheaper and more productive. The other barrier is one which is perhaps more important, than it testifies to the comments just now about some of the political economy barriers. With any technology change, there'll be winners and losers. The winners are often quite diffuse. They're all of us. They're all consumers. They're future sectors which are still being developed and haven't yet been brought to market. The losers pretty much know who they are. They know how much they're going to lose. They know which politicians' ear to bend to prevent the change. Now, they need to be brought on board. In many cases, they need to be retooled or reskilled. They need to be put into a position where they can actually take advantage of the opportunities brought on by the changing economy. And it's natural that you'd expect those whose livelihoods are going to change to try and resist that change, and often very effectively, even if it's at the detriment of the rest of society and possibly their own detriment in the long term. So those barriers need to be taken very, very seriously if we're to get over the hurdles and bring about the kind of new economy that we know we need for the 21st century.
Great, please, Rhian-Mari.
I was just going to make a point that obviously is pretty timely, given that we're all having to do this conference from the comfort of our own homes, and that is the barrier that is being presented by the pandemic. And there's been some quite disturbing analysis, I think, done by Vivid Economics, showing that 16 of the G20 rescue packages so far are encouraging environmentally negative outcomes. And we understand why. There's a need to support the sort of jobs, as Dimitri is saying, that are the status quo. But we do know that investing in the status quo is effectively investing in stranded assets in many cases. And so we really do need this rhetoric around a green recovery to translate into the right sort of incentives and the right sort of fiscal stimulus as we move forward.
Thanks for that. Can I just ask a naive question about that? Could you give us any specific examples of the kind of counterproductive sort of undertakings that are being made around the pandemic solution? Are we talking about telling people to drive their own cars because it's more hygienic than public transport, or something other than that?
No, it's providing finance for industries that we know have to they have to pivot, they have to innovate, they have to change, but they currently employ a lot of people. It's the whole just transition challenge that we have. Clearly, I think one of the things, on a more positive note, and I do tend to try and be optimistic about this, is we have seen a big reframing, I think, of green finance and green investment during the pandemic, and that we've moved on a long way from always discussing green in terms of cost, and we now do hear more about green recovery and building back better. And obviously the Prime Minister's 10-point plan was very much presented in terms of jobs, industrial renewal and recovery. So I think that's something that we should definitely welcome. But jobs that are created in 2050, and that's no good. We need the jobs that are available now, and so that's going to need some real thought in making sure that we're channeling capital towards the industries and technologies of the future.
Thanks, Dimitri. You look like you're ready to go.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Rhian-Mari's comments. So, and maybe kind of cut the government or governments in general some slack. I suppose the jury's still out to the extent that there are two elements to the post-pandemic response. The first is rescue, and that really is about sort of preserving livelihoods and keeping businesses solvent. And to some extent, that is almost kind of just putting the economy in aspect and just keeping it on life support, and so that will, by definition, militate against the change that's needed. The real challenge and the real opportunity comes during the recovery phase. And that's when we need to focus on investing in the kinds of assets that offer the greatest potential in a carbon-constrained and resource-constrained world with carbon-constrained and resource-constrained markets of the future. And that's where you want to avoid assets that are either devalued or stranded, and at the same time invest in those kinds of knowledge forms of knowledge capital that can induce the innovation that's necessary to bring about the change we require. And that innovation, by the way, doesn't have to just be technologies and widgets. It's behavioral innovation, it's institutional innovation, it's changing the way we do things in a way that makes a difference relative to what we've been used to over the last century.
Alexandra.
I think building on Dimitri's comments, there's a third area that we need to be looking at, which is resilience. So we need to learn from what we've gone through now and structure our data-enabled economy and society to be more resilient, because there will be another shock. Might be another pandemic. There will be another shock that will make us change the way we do things, and we need to be resilient. So we need to use this chance to make sure that this data-enabled economy and society that we're creating is truly resilient.
Very good. If I may, then I'll pick up another question from the audience. So what are some of the existing frameworks by which policy making and financing work together to help de-risk the early stage technologies we might need for net zero? Anybody care to have a go at that? Please.
I was just going to leap in with very practical examples of things like contracts for differences, where you provide a floor price for a technology or a good that enables investors to take comfort on future cash flows. There's a similar argument about providing first loss guarantees, for example, where public finance is used to reduce the risk for that private finance can invest in certain riskier situations. So we see that being used to great effect as well. So there are lots of examples where we don't have them yet, but we could do, and also that touches on some of the data points that Alexandra's been raising as well. If we look at electric vehicles, for example, there's a genuine challenge about the residual value of electric vehicles in a secondary market, because obviously we don't have a lot of that data because the market isn't that well developed, or that isn't old enough. So being able to provide some kind of floor price mechanism for what the value of that residual of that vehicle will be at the end of its useful life reflects itself in the leasing terms and the financing terms that mainstream financial providers are able to give to consumers. There's a similar dynamic when you look at retrofitting ships, for example, something else we know we need to do. It takes a long time. By the end of retrofitting a ship, you could have technological obsolescence, innovation may have moved on, regulation may have moved on. So again, that's without some kind of certainty on price, or at least providing some kind of floor. You can see how that is providing a barrier to private finance to invest up front. There are lots of other examples very similar to that, Alex, but we have seen them deployed well. And I mentioned offshore wind earlier, which was a huge success.
Okay. Peter?
Yeah, just throwing in on top of this sort of CFD thing. Of course, there's a cap and floor mechanism that we use for interconnectors, and we're seeing lots of interconnectors being built to the continent. We're looking at kind of similar mechanisms for storage. Storage is going to be so important in the future energy system, with the I guess the intermittency of renewable sort of power generation. To my earlier point about sort of innovation funding, you know, we're funding all sorts of hydrogen-based initiatives through our real price controls, you know, to sort of really sort of test the technology and sort of develop some sort of real-world demonstrators to you know, to prove that this is one of the pathways towards net zero.
Alexandra.
So I think adding on to that, the government funds through UKRI, obviously some blue skies research, which is fantastic and provides the next level, but also that innovation research through Innovate UK. So that's about working academic institutions, working with industry institutions on those early stage technologies, whether it's proof of concept, whether it's demonstrators. And it's broader than that. It's not just about the tech. We're also aware that there are behavioural changes that need to happen. So that research in its broadest sense is funded from government.
Very good. And that picks up on the second half of the question, which is how the scientific community feeds into this. So clearly the participation of innovation coming from academic science, as well as with entrepreneurs and in partnership with corporates, that's all the kind of thing which Innovate is so good at stitching together. And you know, the calls for funding tend to support favourably those initiatives which actually have participation by all of those different kinds of groups. But that's clearly extremely important, because each of them is necessary to sort of reinforce the quality of the results of those programs. And yet, of course, the other thing important to remember is that in early stage technology experimentation, there will and should be failures. And I think there's sometimes perhaps a reluctance amongst policymakers and those in control of public funds to accept that actually failure is important. That's actually part of the scientific method, to have a lot of experiments go on and for some of them to, quote, go wrong, unquote, although really it's all about discovering, you know, what the most viable solutions are, whether that's technologically viable, whether it's economically viable. So I think it's really important to continue to provide those incentives and accept that, you know, some of the money will appear to be wasted, but that may in fact be about refining the quality of the solutions that really work. Very good. So moving on, perhaps we can consider next what we think would be the ideal next steps for the UK. Do people have some fantasies of their own about what we would like to see happen that isn't already happening, or some prescription that they'd like to write for how we could make things go better? Anyone care to start? Now, surely you've all got a fantasy up your sleeve. Alexandra.
I'll fire away. So I'm coming at it from the technical side. So I think there are three things that we need to incentivize. One is systems of systems thinking. We know we can't solve net zero if we work in silos. So we need to have that thinking broadly across government to make it work. The next one is good information management. And I'm not just talking data science. Information management, information sharing in a secure and resilient fashion, it's an essential enabler to net zero. It's on the critical path, and without it, we won't get there. And the third thing is that government policy has to pick up the advantages of enabling this function of effective information management, use it in its own world, as it were, and understand the systematic nature of the net zero challenge so that it can properly address it. So those would be the three things I would look for.
Okay, and so your third point is that the government actually needs to lead by example in the first two things. In other words, to be doing information, am I allowed to call it data sharing, data management, and likewise in the systems of systems thinking. I mean, can I just ask you just to explain that a little bit more, just in case people in the audience don't immediately intuit what that means? Can you give us an example of how you would elucidate systems of system thinking?
If we were looking at a city and we just looked at our transport network, that would be a lot of information we might gather from that. But we get so much more if we link that transport network with our energy network, with our water network, with how people are going about their daily business, when the schools open, when the hospitals open. If we can get those individual systems linked together through data, we get a much better set of information to be able to make better decisions with. So systems to systems thinking is basically linking up little silos of information, making sure that we look at the whole picture.
Thanks, that's a really clear explanation. I've got to ask you though, do you think that IT technologies are available to actually do that adequately? You know, lots of the lesson of history is that every time you want to add one more field to your database, it breaks everything you already built.
So this is why the information management framework is critical. That is the network, the framework, if you like, the rules of the game that will allow us to share our data effectively. And without that, we're in danger of having silos because data might not be interoperable. So that's my second piece, was we need to have this information management framework. We need to have good information management. If we can do that, yes, I think we can break down the silos. Understood.
Peter, you look like you're ready to say something.
Okay, I guess my three things. Well, the first one I'll throw out there is the system architecture concept that is, you know, often talked about, but there is no central architect for the future energy system, you know, and so it's a big unanswered question out there as to whether we need some party that is joining all the dots in this system of systems, if you like. The second point I'd like to make is that the real need for behavioural change. So in decades gone by, the energy system has worked by, you know, consumers have taken demand for energy when they need it. And power stations and kind of gas supply has adjusted to meet that demand. In the future energy system, we're basically governed by the supply side. The supply side is driven by the weather. So we're going to have periods of surplus energy when it's sunny, when it's warm, when it's windy, and then on evenings like tonight, where it's dark and still, we're going to have huge deficits. Storage, storage is great, but we're never going to have the kind of technology for the kind of interseasonal storage that we get through fossil fuels. So to bridge that gap, part of the answer will be consumers. Consumers will have to change their behaviour in terms of the way they use energy, and I think that's in part achieved through better data, better information, and technology that will enable behavioural change.
That's probably the most contentious part of what's been proposed so far, is the idea that people can be retrained to behave in different ways. I mean, the lesson of history is that that's actually extremely challenging to do, and in fact, using perverted incentives is the only way to get that to happen. I mean, you're talking, aren't you, about not having people switch the heating on in the morning, or not all make a cup of tea in the break between the two halves of the football. That's pretty difficult, isn't it, to get people to change their behaviour in those really macro ways?
Indeed it is, and part of our challenge has been even just getting consumers to switch to a cheaper energy tariff. Most consumers just stick with their traditional energy supplier, and yet there's huge savings to be had by shopping around, and they don't. So yeah, that engagement piece is really quite a challenge, a behavioural kind of science challenge. That
sorry.
Go on. Sorry.
I was just going to say that specific example probably tells you as much about interacting with call centres as anything else. It's a disincentive for everyone, isn't it? Would anyone else like to step in? Rhian-Mari, please.
Well, I'm struggling. I think I must be really greedy, because I really quite admire Peter and Alexandra being able to limit their asks down to just 3. So I think that's why I'm struggling a little bit with your question, Alex.
Well, I think they're prioritising, to be fair. So you're allowed 15, but we don't have time for them all, so you have to pick the top 3.
Fair enough. So if I'm only allowed to go for a really short list, I think I'm going to go for 2 things. I'm going to go for the UK showing real leadership on financing for nature. So expanding the E of ESG in finance to go beyond climate and carbon, and to really focus on biodiversity, soils, air, water, and which are very challenging from a financing perspective, but we're making great strides. We're looking forward to the Disruptor review coming out in the new year. There's a task force on nature-related financial disclosures that the UK is playing a key role in moving forward. And there are some very interesting discussions about the sorts of vehicles and facilities that can mobilize both public and private finance towards nature-based solutions. So I'd really like us to push that agenda and show some real leadership. I think the second would be on investing in spatial and digital data that we can then use to support disclosure processes. So key to reallocating capital towards greener outcomes, transitioning our entire energy system, etc. We're looking at $1 to $2 trillion a year that needs to be reallocated. Sums that are obviously within reach when we look at, we have $110 trillion of assets under management in 2020. So it should be possible. But currently all our, disclosure and data is going to be absolutely key to doing that. And our disclosure processes at the moment are entirely reliant on standards and scenarios and cooperation and transparency by those who are responsible for disclosure. And through digital systems, and I think this was fantastically highlighted in the Royal Society's recent report, you can use satellite data or ground sensor data that can really generate data directly so that emissions from physical assets and business processes can be accurately measured. And I think that would change the entire dynamic. And then there are just too many things for me to pick a third, so I'm just going to leave it
All
there.
right, we're going to, well done. In that case, we're going to give Dimitri a chance.
Well, I thought I would slightly sidestep the prioritization point, but also kind of rope in the behavioral change point, and emphasize the fact that it really is about a coherent and credible policy set. There's no one policy or even limited number of policies that are going to do this if they are contradicted by policies which, you know, continue to push investment in carbon intensive assets, which send mixed muddled signals or the wrong mood music, you name it. It's got to be something that convinces investors with confidence that this is the way forward. And to kind of, you know, tap into your question about changing behavior, let me look at this from the top down. One of the things that got the international negotiations moving as we went into the Paris Agreement was actually a shift in emphasis from having to kind of roll our sleeves up and sacrifice our growth in order to save the planet and save the polar bears through what was called burden sharing. You know, we each have to kind of do our bit. Instead, come Paris, there was a move towards recognizing the opportunities from decarbonisation and the self-interest, which is why you have these voluntary agreements. Different countries have different reasons to decarbonise. For some countries, it might be particulate pollution, which is the priority. In others, it might be fabricating and exporting kit. It might be energy security, you name it. But it turns out that actually there's a whole load of advantages associated with decarbonisation that can get the ball rolling. And I think, coming back to the original question about policies, it's not going to be public investment that's going to do this. Public investment is going to send a very clear signal and provide the infrastructure. But as I said earlier, it's going to be public policy and it's going to be public institutions that garner the private investment, which is really what's going to do this. If you look at the PM's 10-point plan, it's been criticized, you know, for committing only 12 billion, which is what some tiny fraction of what's going to go into HS2. But that's slightly to miss the point, because it's going to be about a heck of a lot more than that investment. There's more investment the government needs to commit to. But if the government sets a clear policy agenda that the private sector is confident enough will endure beyond the next electoral cycle, then they'll see the opportunities associated with it, and then the big private finance will start to come in. So long as the public sector covers the policy risk, which the private sector doesn't own, and that's where you know, a British investment bank and some of the institutions, you know, that Rhian-Mari works with, will play such an important role. So it's really all about emphasizing opportunity and galvanizing investment, and that's what's going to bring about the change. Unfortunately, it's not going to be whether you decide to drive your kids to school or take one less holiday, even though those will make, you know, those will have an impact on the margin.
Well, that sounds like pretty much just as easy a challenge as changing the behaviour of the population, to have the government produce a coherent set of policies. But hopefully the Royal Society's report and indeed this conference will help to increase the likelihood of that. Thanks very much to everybody for their answers there. I'm going to move us on now. There's been a question from the audience. Are there other countries with schemes we could learn from in terms of developing data infrastructure for net zero, e.g. through digital twins? Alexandra.
So in the UK, we're remarkably lucky. We're at the forefront of this. So we have a building information modelling programme where we're looking to create a global network to share how do you use your information better, working with other countries. We have a national digital twin programme, which is seen by many as leading the world. That programme works with other countries. So we're looking at what's happening in Singapore, what's happening in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands, in the States, Australia and New Zealand. They all have a slightly different approach, and there are slightly different governance structures in place because they're quite different countries, but there's a lot we can all learn from each other. This is something that the UK is lucky that we are certainly in the vanguard here, but it's something that we can't do on our own. We need to talk, we need to share, and we need to look at these other countries, see what's worked really well, what hasn't, then adapt that for each individual country as we go forward.
Very good. Well, that's an encouraging perspective. Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in on that? Otherwise, we'll keep going. So a question which looks like it has a clear, obvious responder. Ofgem will have its first ever chief data officer. What difference could it make for net zero, Peter?
Hi, yes. So Helen joined us a week or so, and I had my first meeting with this morning, actually. So yeah, she's been brought in to build a bit like I built a sort of an engineering sort of centre of excellence with Ofgem. She's doing the same for data. Her focus will be sort of the use of data within the organisation, but basically enabling the digitization of the energy system. She's starting, from a very low base in terms of where we are, but her insights into how the sort of technologies that we could use, the sort of data that we could take advantage. It will be invaluable to sort of taking forward our sort of view of digitization and helping the networks and the energy companies develop their digital strategies. So we're delighted to have her on board.
Well, and we wish her the best of luck. That sounds like a really exciting development and a challenging position for her to take up. So thanks for that. The next question we've had from the audience is about fracking. The government's gone back and forth on policy around fracking. Do we think that fracking is compatible with net zero goals? And I'd like everyone on the panel who's willing to answer on that question. Anyone care to start?
I'll jump in and just say our current role is to ensure that consumers get energy at lowest cost, a reliable source of energy at lowest cost. And indeed, if gas from fracking can provide that, then that's something we as a regulator should encourage. But actually, our remit has been rewritten to being one of supporting zero carbon. So, once that gets rewritten, my personal view is that, fracking doesn't fit with our future goals.
Very clear, although I think we just understood that was not a policy statement of Ofgem yet.
No, it can't be, because that's how I read it.
That change of mission statement from the goal being lowest cost to the goal presumably being lowest carbon impact or something like that, that's got to be an essential change in your mandate to be able to actually enable this whole agenda to be serviced adequately. So it's very encouraging to hear actually that that change is likely to come to pass, and then we'll have to let the fracking industry face the consequences in due course. Very good. I'm going to move towards the close now. We're just down towards the last 10 minutes or so. I'm hopeful that you're going to be able to offer the audience some optimism. And the question is, what are you optimistic about? There sounds like a lot of activity going on in this domain, a lot of initiatives. But of course, the challenges are in actually executing and delivering on those. So what do we have that we can be positive about? And perhaps someone be willing to go first. Dimitri.
Go on, why not? Whenever the question of optimism comes up, I like to invoke Paul Romer, who's the Nobel Prize-winning economist. He has this wonderful distinction between complacent optimism and conditional optimism, which I think is really worth highlighting. Now, complacent optimism, he says, is the feeling a child gets just sort of waiting for presents to sort of just happen. Conditional optimism, by contrast, is what the feeling a child gets when they think, okay, why don't we build a tree house together? I can get some, other children from the neighborhood. We can get some wood. We can make it really fun, and we can end up with something that's, that feels like a great achievement that we can have fun with afterwards. The point here being that the change didn't just kind of happen as manna from heaven. And we're not going to solve climate change or our resource challenges by just waiting for technologies and innovations to just happen in a vacuum. They will happen if we steer them, if we push them, and if we design them. And I think, this is often to the sort of, the bane of my profession, is that there are so many attempts to deterministically forecast the future, which is flawed, not just because the future is innately uncertain, but it's path dependent. In other words, the cost of decarbonizing is a function of the decisions, the choices, the investments that we make today. And what we do know is that the sooner we start, the earlier we manage this transition, the cheaper it's going to be and the bigger the opportunities. We don't know what the cost is going to be, but it's going to be lower if we start taking action now. So rather than sort of fruitlessly try and predict the future, we should actively get going in designing and steering that future. So I'm conditionally optimistic, but it won't just happen. It will require leadership and it will require early action.
Okay, well, that's great. I think conditional optimism is probably all anybody feels they're justified in having at the moment. Rhian-Mari.
I'm going to pick up on Dimitri's final point about leadership, and that I think is where my optimism comes from. As we go into 2021 and the UK co-hosting the COP, we see leadership from, well, one from the UK in resetting our NDCs with our new goals, 68% reduction in emissions versus 1990 baseline. We had the surprising news from China this summer of getting to carbon neutrality by 2060, and they too will be setting new nationally determined contributions, NDCs. And President-elect Biden, as a new leader in the US, saying that he too will be attempting to pull forward an NDC in the first months of his presidency. So I think examples of real leadership that can give us optimism. But on a more personal note, this morning I had the opportunity to speak at a breakfast that was chaired by the Lord Mayor with some of the leading chief execs and chief CEOs of some banks and building societies and investors across the UK. And I gave a real call to action based on some COP unit guidance as to what we want to see the finance industry doing next year, signing up for net zero targets and the race to zero, signing up for TCFD and a whole raft. And it wasn't so long ago that I'm not sure how that conversation would have gone, but this morning they were all scribbling down notes. And I actually found that to be incredibly optimistic, and it was a great start to my day, which is obviously ending on a high note now as well. Thank you, Alex.
Nicely put, thank you. Alexandra, would you mind going next?
Absolutely. So in the pandemic, we've found new digital ways of working. We've been looking at how we use data and digital more effectively, and people are much more comfortable with that. And I think we will get the information we need to make the correct decisions around the net zero agenda and the data-enabled net zero agenda by using our data better. People realize now that we have a choice, we can choose what we do, we can choose our future, but we need to act to do it. If we can use data effectively, sharing it resiliently, sharing it securely, we can model, we can make better decisions. And we in the UK and globally, but in the UK, we have some of the best brains in the world working on how do we use data to enable net zero. So I'm really positive, and going back to the last session, we can tackle climate change if we work together. And I think we're starting to do that. The pandemic has changed our mindset. So I'm really optimistic that we will be able to do that.
Well, thanks. And by the way, that's one of the questions that was asked by the audience as we've been talking, is about whether the urgency and speed of innovation seen by the pandemic actually helps accelerate work towards net zero. So it's interesting to hear you point towards that. Peter, would you mind giving us your thoughts that are optimistic about the future?
So I like big engineering projects. So my optimism, I guess, stems from the huge pieces of infrastructure. I know that we need to build, and I expect, and we're already starting to see the green shoots of investment in that future system. So, we expect announcements around new nuclear power stations. The government's already talked about the clusters for CCUS. We're already investing in all sorts of hydrogen innovations. Hydrogen, has a huge potential for, decarbonising heat alongside electrification of heat as well. EVs, that it's going to happen. It's going to happen. It's going to happen really, really quickly. And the big one for me is the 40 gigawatts of offshore wind and the building of an offshore transmission network to bring that energy ashore. Lots and lots of big energy projects I see over the next several decades, and I think it's going to be great.
Well, that's an encouraging thought. Rhian-Mari, sure, please.
I was going to say, someone in the chat box written they're optimistic because they can see a wall of money for green is coming. And I just wanted to re-emphasize that. And in the first 3 quarters of 2020, ESG funds have received over $87 billion of net inflows globally. And that compares to $123 billion of net outflows from broad equity funds. So I agree with you, Andy Hopper.
Yeah, good to feel that the investors are, putting their checkbooks where we need them, and clearly having consumers demand that their money be invested in ethically appropriate investments is really important. So everybody in the audience can do something to help advance that agenda by pounding the table for their pension money, their savings money to be invested in ways which prioritize the sustainability agenda, and everybody has a role to play in contributing to that. So in fact, even though the challenges are many, it seems as if the panel's actually been quite optimistic. It's full of how the governments of the world are already doing some of the right things. The list of potential incentives to actually cause more of the right things to happen is pretty long. Indeed, we struggled to fit all of people's hopes in. And there were plenty of grounds for optimism as we heard about the various progress and steps that are already being taken. So I think that's actually a pretty good way to end a day talking about net zero. And I hope the audience agrees that we've had some really fantastic wisdom from the panelists that we've had here this afternoon. So I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us here, both in the audience and on the panel. We really appreciate your participation. And I think at that point, I'm going to bring things to a conclusion. We're just going to allow ourselves a handful of minutes ahead of schedule. And I'm going to ask Sue Ion if she's ready to step back in and bring the afternoon to a close. Over to you, Sue.
Sure, many thanks indeed, Alex, and particular thanks to you for chairing this panel session, and to our amazing panelists for such a great and interactive discussion, which, given the number of questions coming through, the audience clearly appreciated too. So it's my job to just briefly summarise today, and also to remind you that, of course, we have the second chapter tomorrow afternoon, and we'd like to welcome you back to that session tomorrow, where we'll be exploring the vision for future cities and the post-COVID recovery and the social implications of widespread digital adoption. So please come back tomorrow for that. But before I close, my thanks to Professors Emily Shukra and Jim Skee for giving us the key starters with their opening talks, and all the subsequent talks and panel session that have followed. I mean, we've really heard this afternoon how digital can make such a difference to us in the way in which we assess and monitor risk, how we can contribute to sustainable solutions, and the vast data sets that are now available for us that we can interpret intelligently. So data, its means of acquisition, the incredible innovations in industry, which through instrumentation enables the data capture and its analysis. The fact that there is a huge gap still in understanding about what the digital world has to offer. I mean, clearly the experts know, but getting that wider understanding across policymakers about the huge amount of data which can materially affect the systems we create and the way we can monitor and analyse what is needed. And in the final policy session here, key things like the fact that the policy needs to be sufficiently credible to trigger the right sort of investments at scale. The role of the public sector in partnership in making sure that the right markets are shaped and the investment can be made. The need for a holistic approach, that was emphasised by many. Given things like the massive infrastructure investment, which Peter mentioned at the very end there, the holistic approach to ensure we get a systems of systems view to enable the right decisions to be taken, enable essential information management and the coupling of the multidisciplinary needs of the digital world, engineering more generally, and finance. The use of digital to better leverage and target the elements that are needed for the journey to net zero. And then finally, the fact that the pandemic has really increased the sense of urgency and the speed of innovation, which is possible. Hitherto thought to take a lot longer. It clearly can be done. So that sense of urgency and the can-do attitude, coupled with our amazing digital assets and the digitally competent and expert people that we have, I believe can accelerate our journey to net zero. And just a slight political point to follow. This is one area where, you know, cross-party attitudes on a no regrets basis for public investment would really help us to take things forward. So with that, I'll enable you all to make your cups of tea, hopefully staggered so that you don't burden the electricity grid all at the same time. And I look forward to seeing you all at part 2 tomorrow. So thank you very much.